Well, good morning. Welcome to week 11 of 12. So, in case you're wondering, next week is our final week. So sad, but it's been a good time. I've appreciated everyone attending and being um, engaging. I've appreciated that as well, and the questions that you have are great. How many of you know that you're not going to be here next week? 3 of you. So I'm going to hand these out this week. The rest of you will get it next week.
Is that the final exam?
It is a.
I'll sell this to anybody.
It is a review of just let me know your feedback. Just 5 questions, obviously just half a page, so shouldn't take long. So if you want to finish it between now and the end of class, or you want to hand it to me, you'll obviously see me, but hand it to me later, just so that I can get some feedback on how I am as a teacher and the content that we have in the class. I would appreciate that very much. So next week, be thinking about your answers, what you have feedback you have. But anyway, all right, so let's go ahead and pray, and we will get into our lesson. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for today. Thank you so much that we have the opportunity in this country to come and learn about you without fear of oppression and fear of persecution. Lord, we appreciate that. We love you for that. And we want to give you all the praise, honor, and glory in your Son's name. Amen. So this week, well, actually, let's go ahead and just kind of review. Last week, we talked about the theologians of this modern missions time frame. So the 4 theologians that we took a look at, first we looked at John Owen, and I would not be against anyone putting him in the time of the Reformation. You could label him either in the time of the Reformation. He's kind of in that transition time. So either or, doesn't really matter. But I put him here in this time. Probably my favorite theologian throughout church history. I don't know if he'll be surpassed in my lifetime, but I know God continues to work in the minds. I mean, John MacArthur's certainly up there, but John Owen, my favorite theologian, just his view of Christ and his Christology have been heavily influential in my life. Then we looked at Jonathan Edwards, who after that post-Reformation time frame continued on in building the theological understanding of what the Reformers had against the Roman Catholic Church. So he greatly impacted that. He was also a missionary himself, but I put him in the category of theologian there. We talked about Charles Spurgeon. Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers, there in London. Heavily influential on even modern preachers in the way that he delivers and the way he interacts with his congregation, just being genuine. You don't have to use the flowery language, and that helped him connect with his congregation. Same thing with D.L. Moody, who wasn't highly educated, but certainly had a great impact for the gospel wherever he went. Such a great preacher there, founding many institutions that most of them are still in today. So those were the 4 theologians that we took a look at. Now we're going to get into the actual missionaries of this time frame. And I just want to warn you, we may be flying through these. I've got a whole lot of missionaries and a whole lot more that we can't get to. Before we get into our first individual, I did have a handout for Billy Graham. It was asked last week if we could kind of squeeze Billy Graham in. I don't think there's any place that we can really squeeze him into the time frame that we have. But I would certainly categorize him in kind of the missionary feature. You could categorize him however you want, but I think he was a preacher, but he traveled all over the world and was greatly influential in many countries. So missionary, he probably fits well in with that. So I do have a handout for Billy Graham if you're interested in that. I may have to skip 1 or 2 of the other individuals that I have just based on time. If we end up skipping at least one of them, I do have a handout for them as well that you can take for your your own information if you're interested. But as far as the first missionary that we're going to take a look at, we talked a little bit about him last week, George Whitefield, 1714 to 1770. He was a key figure with Jonathan Edwards in the First Great Awakening. Because he included both free blacks and slaves in his revivals, his preaching is often credited as the beginning of the African American Christianity. As a friend of John and Charles Wesley, he was also very important to the early Methodist movement. Whitefield is known as a charismatic orator. In fact, a lot of his preaching used the skills that he built in theater. So he was very dramatic in the way that he preached, and that drew a lot of crowds for him because it was different than the I hate to say dry preaching that had become commonplace. So he was a lot different than most of the preachers, especially in the American colonies. There was an opportunity where he went to the American colonies. I believe he took 7 trips back and forth between England or the United Kingdom and the American colonies. And he after his first trip, he actually left a kind of a publicist in the American colonies to build up his reputation, so that by the next time he traveled over, his crowds were double what they were previously. So definitely a very charismatic guy there. He was born December 27th, 1714, as the 7th child to Thomas and Elizabeth Whitefield, inn owners in Gloucester, Great Britain. His father died when George was just 2 years old, and his mother worked hard to keep the inn going and provide for the children. Due to these meager beginnings, the only way for George to attend university, in fact, he went to Oxford with John and Charles Wesley. The only way he could afford it was becoming sort of a servitor to some of the more affluent students, the ones that had more money, that they could pay him to do the menial jobs that they didn't want to do. So that's how he put himself through college. He met John and Charles Wesley there and joined their Holy Club. Whitefield even led the Holy Club when John and Charles left to the American colonies, left to Georgia. And we'll talk about the Wesleys next week with the hymn writers. But he ended up graduating Oxford in 1732 and was ordained a minister in the Anglican Church. He believed that true Christianity should engage the heart and not just the intellect. So his sermons were passionate and designed to elicit emotional responses from the audience. The Anglican Church, however, refused to give him a parish in order to serve, so Whitefield became an itinerant preacher. He traveled from here to there and kind of what we would call an evangelist today, just traveling from church to church, filling in where needed and having little revival meetings, if you will. In his travels, he often chastised local clergy for their lack of spiritual fervor. Go figure. But he ended up regretting that later in life. He regretted that his passion and zeal drove him to almost berate these clergy that he was going to meet. It obviously did not go well with them, and he may not have been invited back because of his attitude. So later in life, he regretted the way in which he presented that. He rejected ecclesiastical authority, so obviously he was against the Pope being Protestant, but he didn't want any one person being above anyone else in that in the church itself. And in the Anglican Church, known as the Church of England, you have the king, the monarchy, kind of over that. Because he was against that, he was very revered in the American colonies because they obviously didn't like the monarchy either. They wanted more of a democratic rule. So he had a lot of followers and was very popular in the American colonies. In 1738, he made his first of 7 eventual trips to the American colonies. There he used his love of acting to preach sermons in a theatrical way. This was a new style for the colonists. They'd never experienced the theater. His message was often related to the new birth. He averaged 10 sermons per week and traveled so extensively that nearly every person in the American colonies had heard him preach at one time. While in Savannah, Georgia, Whitefield saw the need for an orphanage and vowed to raise money for the project back in England. In 1740, construction began on the Bethesda Orphanage. Whitefield also partnered with the Moravian Brethren to build an orphanage in Pennsylvania. Later partnered with Benjamin Franklin to establish the Charity School for Boys. So a lot of good he did in the American colonies during that time. And just a few decades later, they end up going to war with England. So, while back in England raising these funds, George married a young widow, Elizabeth James, in 1741. She suffered pregnancy loss 4 times before giving birth in 1743 to a son who died 4 months later. She then accompanied Whitefield on a trip to the American colonies from 1744 to 1748, but never accompanied him after that. She preceded him in death on August 9th, 1768, after succumbing to a fever. While Whitefield was away in America, William Seward was his fundraiser, business coordinator, and publicist. He was the first internationally famous itinerant preacher. Besides the American colonies, he also preached in Scotland, Ireland, Bermuda, Gibraltar, and the Netherlands, as well as every county on the English Isle, including Wales. Overall, he preached at least 18,000 sermons and probably to about 10 million people in his lifetime. Benjamin Franklin actually conducted a test during one of his sermons that he could be heard over 500 feet away. And in a semicircle, he established that he could preach to 30,000 people at once without, obviously, microphones. So pretty boisterous voice. I mean, I guess his theater training helped him with that, but he was influential in early American politics. While the Wesleys were steadfastly abolitionists campaigning against slavery, Whitefield instead advocated for the humane treatment of slaves. He wrote an open letter in 1740 condemning the cruelty and abuse of slaves in America. He was a staunch Calvinist, emphasizing the sovereignty of God, and John Wesley was a staunch Arminian, emphasizing a person's free will. The two were recognized as co-workers and friends, but these theological differences did cause a rift in their relationship early on. The two ended up reconciling and became close, so close, in fact, that Whitefield asked Wesley to preach at his eulogy if he preceded him in death. Whitefield ended up dying in Newburyport, Massachusetts, of a severe asthma attack after falling ill in September of 1770. He preached his final sermon just the day before and fought through the illness to evangelize, inviting his listeners to come poor, lost, undone sinner, come just as you are to Christ. John Wesley fulfilled his promise to his friend and preached at his funeral service held in his honor in London in November 18th, 1770. So that was George Whitefield. Next is David Brainerd, 1718 to 1747. April 20th, 1718, David Brainerd was born to devout Christian parents in Haddam, Connecticut. By the age of 14, he and his 8 siblings had lost both their parents to illness and were left orphans. In his early years, David was very careful and serious in following God. However, once he said, "I have a very good outside, but my heart is exceedingly sinful." He made a commitment to enter the ministry even though he was not a believer. When he was 19, he moved to an inherited farm and read through the entire Bible twice in a year and began to see that his religion was legalistic and based upon his own efforts. He wrestled with God's sovereignty in his soul and battled deep depression. He strongly fought with the fact that there is nothing he could do in his own strength to commend himself to God. something that a lot of people never learn. This changed one evening before sunset when he was radically transformed by a new vision of God's glory. He found unspeakable joy in letting Jesus be king over his whole life and the whole earth. That night, he determined to live wholly for God so that God's glory could be known. 2 months later, Brainerd entered Yale and began to prepare himself for a career in ministry. His first year was rough as he dealt with multiple illnesses, which caused him to go home. In the fall of 1740, he returned to find that the spiritual atmosphere there at Yale had drastically changed. This was during the period of the First Great Awakening, so a lot of those Great Awakening preachers came and preached to the students, and a lot of them were radically changed. So by the time he came back, he saw this great change among the student body, so much so that the students thought that their professors were weak Christians. Just because they had been in the faith for a while and had kind of lessened in their zeal and fervor. So the student body, in their enthusiasm for the gospel, believed them to be unconverted. David Brainerd was the top of his class academically, but was promptly expelled in his third year. He was overheard by one of his professors that his tutor had no more grace than a chair. David greatly regretted his mistake and apologized. He made several attempts to get back into the college, but was still refused entry. He ended up being discouraged. During that time, there was a new law that was passed that in order to preach, you had to have graduated from Harvard, Yale, or any of the European universities. So if he wasn't allowed back into the college, he wouldn't be able to preach. So he ended up discouraged, not able to get back into the college. And so he began to question his calling from God. In 1742, David Brainerd received his license to preach by Jonathan Dickinson, who later founded Princeton. He asked if David had considered becoming a missionary. After praying about it, Brainerd was overwhelmed with a strong desire from God to be a missionary to the American Indians. On November 25th, 1742, Brainerd was examined for his fitness for the work and appointed as a missionary to the Native Americans along the Delaware River. In the spring of 1743, David spent a year of grueling work among the Indians there, about 20 miles northwest of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. While he preached with a translator, he also started a school for Indian children and tried learning the language so that he could translate some of the Psalms. However, he never really saw spiritual transformation among that group of Indians. After a year there, the mission board decided to move him to another part of the Delaware River to another tribe. He fought with grasping the intricate dialects of those particular Indians and suffered from physical weariness, illness, and a deep mistrust from the Indians. They had obviously had interactions with white traders before and had been less than honest in those dealings, so they didn't trust him all that much at first. Within the same year, he traveled to the surrounding tribes, but the people were unresponsive to his message. He ended up contracting tuberculosis, and so he was fighting that, a cold, lack of sleep, and hunger. He fought to continue in his ministry among the Indians, and in the summer of 1745, Brainerd was relocated to Crossweaksung, New Jersey, to preach to the Indians there. Within a year, there were 130 Indians that accepted Christ as their Savior, and 77 of them he ended up baptizing. David was amazed at this turn of events, and even more amazed when he saw the fruit of their faith still in action weeks later. When David preached a sermon among the people, the entire tribe would fall down on their faces and weep for hours because they were concerned that they had not known of the great sin toward the Lord that they obviously had. They discovered fierce longings in their soul for Christ to save them from the misery they felt and feared. The Spirit of God was at work in awakening the natives' hearts, and calling them out of their sin and shame while revealing his great love for them. David has several accounts in his journal where he tells the story of the Indians' repentance in Christ. I'm going to put a couple of his journal entries here on the screen. You're welcome to read them. We're not going to read them together, but you're welcome to read them or take a picture, whatever you'd like. So, in the spring of 1746, David helped the entire Native American Christian community from Crossweek move to Cranberry to have their own land and village. He stayed with these Indians until he grew too sick with tuberculosis to preach. During autumn, he moved to Elizabethtown to recover at the house of Jonathan Dickinson, who had originally commissioned him to be a missionary. March 20th, 1747 was the last visit David Brainerd made to his Indian friends. He then rode to the house of Jonathan Edwards in Northampton, Massachusetts, where he was cared for by Jonathan's daughter. A couple months later, he died at the age of 29 from tuberculosis in Edwards' house on October 9th. David Brainerd was a missionary for 4 years. He was sick with tuberculosis for the last 8 years of his life and struggled with loneliness, depression, loving the Indians, fighting beauty in nature, and staying true to the calling as a missionary rather than try to return to college to become a minister. Nothing could stop him from obeying the call that God had placed on his heart. While he was only a missionary for 4 years, the impact he made had eternal value. Because of his prayers and persistence in seeking after God's will in difficult circumstances, God used his story to encourage later missionaries, including William Carey, Jim Elliot, and Adoniram Judson, as well as those who deal with the same struggles that he did. They often look to Brainerd's life in the woods of America as an example. Despite Brainerd's suspension from Yale, the university later named a building after him, Brainerd Hall, at the Yale Divinity School, which is the only building on campus that was named after a student that was expelled. It is hard to not to wonder what if Brainerd had gone back to college if the modern missionary movement had been the same. It's amazing to think the impact in 29 years of his short life, the impact that he made on later missionaries. However, his expulsion brought about the founding of both Princeton and Dartmouth. Dartmouth originated from a school founded by Eleazar Wheelock for the Native Americans and colonists in 1748, which had been inspired by Brainerd's example of Native American education. David also had made a great impact on both Jonathan Dickinson and Aaron Burr, the founders of Princeton, who were indignant by the refusal of him not being able to return to Yale. These men were inspired by David's ardent passion for God, his hunger for holiness, and his longing to see the lost souls of men be found. This urged several other missionaries, including David's brother John, who worked among the Indians, to fan the spark of missions work with them. I got a short video about Brainerd.
I long to live only to him and to be in tune for his praise and service forever. Oh, for spirituality and holy fervency, that I might spend and be spent for God to my latest moment.
Its contrast with the rest of what Edwards published is that it's a very personal book. It's about a person's life.
It's said that there wasn't a domestic or foreign American missionary who didn't have this work in his saddlebag or in his trunk.
I think it's safe to say that outside the Bible, Jonathan Edwards' publication of the life of David Brainerd is the most influential book on missions in modern history.
He says God has two main ways of commending what they used to call true religion in the world. One is by doctrine and precept, he wrote, and the other is by instance and example.
Edwards wasn't publishing the life of Brainerd to show what an exemplary missionary looks like, but what an exemplary Christian looks like.
And the person that he wrote about the most as a role model of true religion or genuine Christianity was David Brainerd.
He's not some macho, rested, tanned, and ready kind of, a rugged American individual ready to go into the wilderness and, dominate the natives.
He's a guy who's out in the woods trying to share the gospel with Native American Indians. He's all by himself. He gets lonely. He has self-doubt.
If the life of Brainerd was as depressing for earlier generations as it is for us, then the question has to be asked is, why did earlier generations continue to read it, and why was it continued to be printed?
The main point of David Brainerd in keeping a journal was introspection. He was actually wanting every day to be aware of how he was struggling spiritually.
A.W. Tozer once used the phrase about the piercing sweetness of knowing Christ, how the closer a person gets to Christ, the more miserable they become, in one sense. Because the closer they get to Christ, the more unlike Christ they realize themselves to be.
So I don't think that dynamic of feeling like a wretched person is ever going to go away until God completely removes our sinfulness.
But I think a real key in reading biography, Christian biography, is to allow it to inspire us and instruct us.
He brings his own kind of broken experience, his own weaknesses, his own foibles with him, and he does something extraordinary, and who wouldn't want to do that with their life?
That was David Brainerd. Next, the father of modern missions, at least that's what he's called, William Carey. At a meeting of Baptist leaders in the late 1700s, a newly ordained minister stood to argue for the value of overseas missions. He was abruptly interrupted by an older minister who said, "Young man, sit down. You are an enthusiast. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he'll do so without consulting you or me." That such an attitude is inconceivable today, as largely due to the subsequent efforts of that young minister, William Carey. He was raised in an obscure rural village in the middle of England. He apprenticed at a local cobbler shop where he was converted. He enthusiastically took up the faith, and though he was little educated, the young convert borrowed a Greek grammar and proceeded to teach himself the New Testament Greek. When his master died, he took up shoemaking in a nearby town where he met and married Dorothy Plackett, who soon gave birth to a daughter. But the apprentice cobbler's life was hard, and that child later died at the age of 2. Carey's family sunk into poverty and stayed there even after he took over the business. All the while, he continued his language studies, adding Hebrew and Latin, and became a preacher with the Particular Baptist. He also continued pursuing his lifelong interest in international affairs, especially the religious life of other cultures. Carey was impressed by the early Moravian missionaries and was increasingly dismayed at his fellow Protestants' lack of missions interest. In response, he penned an inquiry into the obligations of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathens. Whew, quite a title. Very succinct in that. He argued that Jesus' Great Commission applied to all Christians of all times, and he chastised fellow believers of his day for ignoring it. Carey didn't stop there. In 1792, he organized a missionary society, and its inaugural meeting preached a sermon with the call, "Expect great things, attempt great things." Within a year, Carey, John Thomas, a former surgeon, and Carey's family, which now included 3 boys and another child on the way, were on a ship headed for India. Thomas and Carey had grossly underestimated what it would cost to live in India, and Carey's early years there were miserable. When Thomas had deserted the enterprise, Carey was forced to move his family repeatedly as he sought employment that could sustain them. Illness racked the family, and loneliness and regret set in. He learned Bengali with the help of a friend, and in a few weeks began translating the Bible into Bengali and preaching to small gatherings. But when Carey himself contracted malaria and then his 5-year-old Peter died of dysentery, it became too much for his wife, Dorothy. So she suffered delusions, accusing Carey of adultery and threatening him with a knife. She eventually had to be confined to a room and physically restrained. Sometimes we don't see those kind of stories being told, but they are important. Missions work is not an easy thing, even though you think the difference between Paul being a missionary and William Carey being a missionary is night and day. I think Paul would rather have the transportation options and finances and everything like that that Carey had access to, or even that we have access to today. But it's not an easy life, and it can affect the family. And we certainly see that in William Carey's life. In October of 1799, things finally turned. He was invited to move to a Danish settlement near Calcutta, and he was now under the protection of the Danes, who permitted him to preach legally. In December of 1800, after 7 years of missionary labor, Carey baptized his first convert, and 2 months later he published his first Bengali New Testament. With this and subsequent editions, Carey and his colleagues laid the foundation for the study of modern Bengali, which up to that time had been an unsettled dialect. Carey continued to expect great things over the next 28 years. He and his co-laborers translated the entire Bible into India's major languages, including Bengali, Hindi, and Sanskrit, and parts of over 200 other languages and dialects. He also sought social reform in India, including the abolition of infanticide, widow burning, and assisted suicide. He and the followers founded a college in 1818, a divinity school for Indians, which today offers theological and liberal arts education for some 2,500 students. By the time Carey died, he had spent 41 years in India without a furlough. His mission could count for some 700 converts in a nation of millions. But he had laid an impressive foundation of Bible translations, education, and social reform. His greatest legacy was in the worldwide missions movement of the 19th century that he inspired. Missionaries like Adoniram Judson, Hudson Taylor, and David Livingstone, among thousands of others, were impressed not only by Carey's example, but by his words, expect great things, attempt great things. The history of 19th century Protestant missions is in many ways extended commentary on this phrase. Next, we have Adoniram Judson. And sorry, I'm rushing through. We still have a lot to get to, so forgive me. Born in Malden, Massachusetts in 1788, the son of a congregational clergyman, Judson graduated from Brown University and the first class of Andover Theological Seminary in 1810. His interest in missions began in 1809 when he read Claudius Bachan's sermon, The Star in the East. With ministerial friends, he started the Society of Inquiry, a seminary study group on missions. In 1810, he was licensed to preach by the Orange, Vermont Congregational Association preparatory to the pastoral ministry. However, he had strong inclinations toward overseas missions. In June of that year, Judson, Samuel Newell, Samuel Knott Jr., and Gordon Hall presented themselves to the Massachusetts General Association for Missionary Service and the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or ABCFM. Following an unsuccessful attempt to secure an appointment from the London Missionary Society in England, Judson persuaded the ABCFM to support 3 couples and 2 single men on a mission to the East. Judson was the lead candidate of the first commissioning service for the American Overseas Missionaries held at Salem, Massachusetts Tabernacle on February 6, 1812. Following a send-off with great fanfare, Judson and his bride Anne sailed with the Newells for India in 1812. During the 4-month voyage, the couple carefully studied the baptismal positions of the English Baptists in order not to contradict the Baptist position. However, by the time they arrived in Calcutta, they adopted Baptist principles and were baptized by William Carey. Upon their change in sentiments, the Judsons resigned from the ABCFM and plans were laid for the creation of a Baptist Mission Society in the United States. By order of the British East India Company, the Judsons were forced to leave India, escaping to Burma in 1813. They established a station that began the first mission on American Baptists. Their work included evangelism and Bible translation, and in 1824, following the completion of Judson's first dictionary, the couple relocated to establish greater influence with the government. However, Adoniram Judson was charged with being an English spy and was imprisoned in June of 1824. In a 21-month period of incarceration during the war there, he suffered from fever and malnutrition and underwent a forced march. As a result of the courage and resourcefulness of his wife, he was released in February of 1826 to serve as a translator for the Burmese government during negotiations for the treaty to settle the war. And Judson died of complications of smallpox later that same year. To enlarge his efforts, Judson moved his mission in 1828. There, with the assistance of Jonathan Wade, he built a church and school and continued work on the Burmese Bible, which he completed in 1834. Later that year, he married Sarah Hall Boardman, a widow and gifted linguist and teacher. And in 1845, following the birth of their 8th child, Sarah's health declined and the Judsons embarked for the United States. Sarah died en route. Judson completed the trip and remained in the United States for a 9-month furlough. While his strength had been greatly reduced and he suffered chronic laryngitis, he was hailed as a hero throughout the Christian community. While at Madison University in upstate New York, he met and married Emily Chabak, a writer and educator, and they returned to Burma in 1846 for continued work on an enlarged Burmese dictionary, which he later finished in 1849. Shortly afterward, Judson contracted a respiratory fever while attempting to travel to a better climate, but died at sea. I'm going to put up a timeline here of Judson's life because I threw out a lot of dates and a lot of facts going with those dates. So I just want you to see the timeline and how quickly things changed for Judson. So he was born. Sorry for it being so small. I don't know why it's so small, but we'll go with that. He was born in 1788. 1804, he enters Brown University at 16. 1807, he graduates as valedictorian. 1808, he converts to Christianity and enrolls in Andover Theological Seminary. 1810, he became a licensed preacher with a group of others, formed the ABCFM. 1812, he marries Anne on February 5th and is commissioned and sent as a missionary on February 19th. What a honeymoon. 1813, forced to leave India and move to Burma. 1816, completes Burmese grammar and begins Bible translation. 1824, accused of being a British spy and is imprisoned. 1826, Anne secures his release but soon dies of smallpox. 1834, completes Burmese translation of the Bible and marries Sarah and have 8 children together. Sarah dies on a ship in 1845, bound for the U.S. with poor health. 1846, marries Emily and returns to Burma to complete an enlarged Burmese dictionary. 1849, completes the dictionary, and in 1850, he dies of a respiratory fever while trying to travel by sea to find a better climate. So that, in a nutshell, is Adoniram Judson's life. A lot of things happen very quickly, and we certainly see this in Judson's life. Next, we look at one of my favorite missionaries, George Mueller. He's one of my favorite missionaries just for his passion for prayer. I am not a natural prayer. I don't know about you, but I am not. And just reading his biographies, he prayed about everything. It seemed whatever he was doing from the time he woke up to the time he slept, he was praying. And he still felt like he didn't pray enough, according to some of his writings. And just a great man of God. And I'm convicted every time that I'm reading his stories about my own prayer life. Among the greatest accomplishments of what can be done through simple faith in God are the great orphanages covering 13 acres of ground on Ashley Downs, Bristol, England. When God put it in the heart of George Mueller to build these orphanages, he only had 2 shillings or 50 cents in his pocket. Without making his wants known to any man, but to God alone, over £1,400,000 or $7 million in the 1800s were sent to him for the building and maintaining of these orphan homes. Near the time of Mueller's death, there were 5 immense buildings made of solid granite capable of accommodating 2,000 orphans. In all the years since the first orphans arrived, the Lord had sent food in due time so that they never missed a meal. Although he became famous as one of the greatest men of prayer known in history, he was not always a saint. He wandered very deep into sin before he was brought to Christ. In 1805, his father was a revenue collector for the government and was a worldly-minded man. He supplied George and his brother with plenty of money when they were boys, and they spent it very foolishly. Go figure. I don't think that's changed. George deceived his father about how much money he spent and then how he spent it. He also stole government money during his father's absence. For a few weeks after his conversion, Mueller made rapid advancement in the Christian life, and he was greatly desirous of becoming a missionary. But he fell in love with a Roman Catholic girl. And for some time, the Lord was all but forgotten. Then Mueller saw a young missionary giving up all his luxuries and a beautiful home for Christ. This opened his eyes to his own selfishness and enabled him to give up the girl who had taken the place of Christ in his heart. George could not enter any German missionary training institution without the consent of his father, and this was something he could not get. His father was deeply grieved about, after educating him, so he could build a comfortable living as a clergyman, he would turn to missions, which obviously was not a very money-making venture. George felt that he could no longer accept any money from his father, and the Lord graciously sent him means with which to complete his education. He taught German to some American college professors at the university, and they handsomely gave him classes for his services. He gave away thousands of religious tracts and papers and spoke to many people concerning the salvation of their souls. The greatest of all Mueller's undertaking was the building of those great orphanages, and he spent most of his life doing that. There were many times throughout those days where they did not have a meal ready, yet God provided even at the last minute. Whenever the others there at the orphanage would tell Mueller, "We don't have the food," and meal is starting in 20 minutes, he would go into his room and pray. And within those 20 minutes, food would be dropped off at the door. It was just amazing. At the age of 70, Mueller began to do evangelistic tours. He traveled 200,000 miles, going around the world and preaching in many lands and in several different languages. He frequently spoke to as many as 5,000 people. 3 times he preached throughout the United States, going north, south, east, and west. He continued his missionary and evangelistic tours until he was 90 years of age. He estimated that during those 70 years of evangelistic work, he addressed 3 million people. All his expenses were sent in answer to prayer and faith. Now, I have a video of George Mueller, about George Mueller and his life. Well, Okay, so a couple of quotes by him on prayer. The more prayerful you are, the more efficient you will be in all the work for the Lord. And then he says, the greater the difficulty to be overcome, the more it will be seen to the glory of God how much can be done by prayer and faith.
Through the Lord's orphanage, Muller had achieved his goal to give a visible proof that God is real. At the age of 70, Muller showed no signs of slowing down. He wanted to do more to glorify God. I'm visiting the Muller Museum in Bristol to meet Sarah McFadden to learn more of the miraculous events that occurred in Muller's later life.
Well, welcome. This is the George Muller Museum in Bristol.
Fantastic, isn't it? And look at this timeline that's up here. And I think the amazing thing I find about Muller is he's done all these things, and then you get to 70 when most people are thinking about retiring, and he suddenly begins a new ministry.
So George Muller travelled 200,000 miles over a period of 17 years. He did all of this before aviation, so he travelled by boat and even by rickshaw when he was in India. He went as far afield as Australia and New Zealand, and also when he was in the US, he was actually invited to meet the sitting president at the time, President Hayes, at the White House.
Quite amazing, isn't it? I mean, really, transport was very, very basic, wasn't it? It would be by horse and cart the majority of time.
Yeah, absolutely. George Muller would be away from Bristol for up to 2 years at a time on his preaching tour.
One particular story, isn't there, where he was desperate to get to somewhere he was due to preach, and fog descended, and the captain said, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. So the captain tells the story that he was heading to Quebec, and he'd been on the bridge of the ship for 22 hours straight, and he was quite startled when he got a tap on his shoulder, and it was George Muller. And George Muller let the captain know that he needed to be in Quebec in a few days' time for a speaking engagement, and the captain said, it's impossible. Yeah. There's no way. George Muller said, maybe we should pray about it. So George Muller and the captain went down to the chart room, and the captain actually was a bit begrudging in doing it and wondered what lunatic asylum this person was from. But George Muller prayed and asked God to lift the fog so that he could get to Quebec in time.
Isn't there an interesting PS on that story? The captain then thought, I'd better pray.
Yeah.
And Muller said, no, and he stopped him. Why?
He did. George Muller said that no, he didn't need to pray because he felt that God had already answered his prayer and invited the captain to go outside and look. And indeed, when they went outside, the fog had indeed been lifted.
And he got to his meeting in time and...
He did, absolutely. And the captain was actually an unbeliever before this happened, and he attributes his coming to faith to this encounter with George Muller.
I mean, that's what Muller's life was all about, wasn't it? Seeing the miraculous in order that people then would be attracted to the faith and become believers.
Absolutely, yeah. Just a part of his everyday life.
That's George Muller. Just a couple more. We are going to skip David Livingstone. I do have a handout. In fact, why don't you go ahead and just pass it around as we jump into the next.
David Livingstone is a key figure in the history of the exploration of Africa. Livingstone was born on March 19, 1813, in Blantyre, Scotland. As a boy, he developed a passion for the natural sciences, while at the same time receiving a very religious upbringing. In 1840, he graduated from medical school and was ordained as a missionary. He departed for Africa 1 month later with the intent of spreading the word of Christ among the natives. He arrived in Cape Town, South Africa in 1841. In subsequent years, he traveled to the area now known as Botswana, though at the time it was mostly unexplored territory. It was a perilous journey. In 1844, Livingstone was attacked by a lion, causing permanent damage to his arm. Perhaps more painful to him than his wounds, Livingstone was distraught over his failure as a missionary, since the locals refused to embrace Christianity. Livingstone understood that it wasn't possible to spread Christian values without first improving the living conditions of indigenous peoples. According to Livingstone, it would be necessary to increase business contacts between Africa and Europe to achieve his purpose. From that time forward, Livingstone's goal was to find a navigable river linking the heart of Africa with the coast. In 1851, Livingstone was the first white man to reach the top of the Zambezi River. Following the course of the river, he discovered a magnificent falls which he named Victoria in honor of the Queen of England. In 1856, Livingstone returned to London, where he managed to obtain the necessary funds for a second expedition to the Zambezi River. The outcome of this second expedition is disastrous. Almost all of the members in Livingstone's party die of malaria or other diseases. Livingstone also discovers that the Zambezi River is in fact not navigable at all due to the large amount of rapids and waterfalls. Despite this failure, Livingstone refused to give up. In 1864, he went back to London and was able to organize a third expedition. This time, the goal was to search for the headwaters of the Nile River. This latest expedition, however, was never completed. Livingstone vanished. Another British explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, was sent in 1869 to find him. He does indeed find him 2 years later on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Livingstone was now ravaged by malaria, but elected not to return to his homeland until his mission was completed. He would never see his dream realized. Livingstone died in Chintambo, a village in Zambia, on May 1, 1873, at the age of 60. Henry Morton Stanley would continue Livingstone's search for the source of the Nile.
Hudson Taylor. We'll briefly go over him because the last person I really want to spend the rest of our time with, but we'll briefly talk about Hudson Taylor. Born May 21st, 1832 in England to a devout Methodist family. His parents, before he was even born, had prayed that he would be a missionary to China. Though raised in a Christian home, Taylor went through a period of skepticism, and at the age of 17, after reading a tract in his father's study, he committed himself fully to Christ. He began training in medicine and pharmacy in London, which prepared him for medical missionary service. His first voyage to China was in 1853. He sailed for China under the Chinese Evangelistic Society, arriving in Shanghai in 1854 after a 5-month voyage. Unlike most missionaries of the time, he actually adopted the traditional Chinese clothing and hairstyle to reduce any cultural barriers. This was initially controversial, but later admired for its effectiveness. In 1858, he married Maria Dyer, daughter of missionary Samuel Dyer. And they would have several children, though many died young. In 1865, he founded the China Inland Missions, which now goes by OMF International in Brighton, England. Seeing that most missionaries remained in the coastal cities, he was burdened for China's inland population that really had no gospel witness up to that point. An interdenominational mission society relying solely on faith support without fundraising appeals, which obviously was inspired by George Mueller. In 1866, Taylor led a party of 16 missionaries, including women and children, into the inland parts of China. His wife Maria died in 1870 at age 33 due to cholera complications after giving birth to their 8th child, who also died. In total, only 2 of his 8 children lived into adulthood. The oldest daughter, Grace, was especially tough for Taylor, as she was 8 at the time and was buried on the riverbank they were traveling at the time of her death. One of the interesting stories about her particular death, the team that they were with was struggling and was becoming disheartened with what was going on. Again, this was very rare for somebody to go into inland China, and just hard on health and very depressed, and just a hard time for the team. But when Grace had died, being 8 years old, it actually drew them closer together, and it allowed them to accomplish the mission that they had set out to do. So even in the death of an 8-year-old, God can use that to further his kingdom. And that entire mission probably survived due to the death of that young girl. He later remarried to Jean Faulding, that did not result in any children, but joined him for another CIM mission. She survived until a year before Taylor himself had died. Taylor emphasized reliance on God's provision without death, famously saying, "God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply." By the 1880s, CIM missionaries were working in almost every province of China. Taylor made several trips back to England and the US, inspiring thousands to missionary service. His simple faith and reliance on prayer deeply influenced future generations of missionaries. In 1905, though frail, Taylor returned to China one last time. He died June 3rd, 1905, in the Hunan province, where he was buried. On his first voyage, the ship nearly wrecked off the coast of New Guinea. Taylor prayed earnestly, and the wind shifted, saving the ship. He saw this as confirmation of God's calling there. While still a student in London, he lived in a bare attic, giving away nearly all of his income to test living by faith before he went to China. CIM was unique in it being an interdenominational ministry, meaning that it accepted missionaries from multiple different denominations of Protestants. Normally, you would, if Baptist would be in a Baptist mission, Methodist and a Methodist, and so on. He accepted anyone that was willing to go. And he also welcomed, one of the first to welcome single women as missionaries as well. By Taylor's death, CIM had over 800 missionaries, 125 schools, and 300 mission stations throughout China. Though often persecuted, many Chinese respected Taylor because he adopted their customs and sincerely loved them. Some called him the foreigner with a Chinese heart. Now, finally, we get to Amy Carmichael. Many of you probably already know Amy Carmichael, but she was a Christian missionary to India who opened an orphanage and founded a mission in Dohnavur. She served in India for 55 years without furlough and wrote many books about the missionary work she did there. Amy was born in a small village in County Down, Ireland in 1867. Amy attended Harrogate Ladies College for 4 years in her youth. It was there she was converted to Christianity. In the mid-1880s, Carmichael started a Sunday school class for the Shawleys, or mill girls, who wore shawls instead of hats. The mission grew and grew until they needed a hall to seat 500 people. At this time, Amy saw an advertisement in The Christian for an iron hall that could be built for £500 and would seat 500 people. 2 donations, £500 from Miss Kate Mitchell and 1 plot of land from a mill owner, led to the construction of the first Welcome Hall on the corner of Cambridge Street, Heather Street in 1887. Amy continued at the Welcome Hall until she received a call to work among the mill girls in Manchester in 1889, from which she moved on to missionary work. She heard Hudson Taylor founded the China Inland Mission speak about missionary life. Soon afterwards, she became convinced that her calling was missionary work. She applied to the China Inland Mission and lived in London at the Training House for Women, where she met author and missionary to China, Mary Geraldine Guinness, who encouraged her to pursue missionary work. She was ready to sail for Asia at one point when it was determined that her health made her unfit for the work. She postponed her missionary career with the CIM and decided later to join the Church Missionary Society. I'm going to go ahead and skip right to the video for Amy Carmichael because we only have a few minutes left. But certainly something, I actually have a book about Amy Carmichael here. Certainly an interesting story that unfortunately we don't have time to finish. So let's go ahead and watch this video and then we'll close.
We've just arrived at Dohnavur Fellowship here in the far south of India. This is the place Amy Carmichael brought into existence through prayer, you could say. She served here for many years, she died here, and she's left behind this incredible legacy. I'm so excited to go and explore it. So all of this she saw, all of this was built under her? Yes. Okay.
Actually, most of the construction in DF was over by 1950s.
Okay.
All these buildings.
Okay. She died in, is it 1951? Right,
yes.
okay. And when did she first settle here?
Actually, she came to this village in 1900 June.
1902?
Yeah,
Okay.
1900.
Oh, 1900, okay.
1900.
These are the living quarters where she stayed for many, many years. Many of her personal effects are still here. Her library is still here and I believe largely intact. It's interesting to go through. She was a voracious reader and read across many, many topics. Of note, there's lots of commentaries, lots of Bible works, and then there's also quite a lot of biographies. She seemed to enjoy reading biographies of many of the great missionaries. Coming around, there's this painting here of the Matterhorn, and apparently she especially appreciated a metaphor related to mountains, which is sometimes life's trials seem too difficult to endure, and yet just as somebody eventually prevailed and climbed the mountain, so we too can endure and overcome through Christ's help the trials we endure. She spent her later years bedridden, and you can actually see a mark on the ground there where the post of the cot was. But above her bed then, she had these promises that were very precious to her. She would meditate on them, pray and claim those promises to sustain her through very, very difficult days.
When I came here 8 days, baby, I must child.
Oh, really?
I was born in 1948.
1948, okay.
Amma died in 1951.
51, right, so 3 years old.
Amma gave me the name.
Oh, really? She gave you your name?
Flower.
Oh, okay.
That's cool.
Actually, 1924, Amma started to build.
Oh,
This
really?
architect, everything from Kerala.
Okay, so Amy built this, or Amy
Yeah.
oversaw this being built? Wow. She was an ambitious person. Wonderful, beautiful.
Easter Sunday morning,
Yes.
whole family will come here.
Oh, okay.
And she called Amma, Prina.
Prina, right, right.
You know the story about Prina?
I know the story of Prina, yeah.
She called Amma.
Okay.
So Amma likes to call her children Amma.
Okay. Amma is mom, right? Mummy?
Mother.
Mother, yeah, right. So if we go around here and we see a child, they'll be saying Amma to their mother? Okay.
Amma is Kerala word. Amma is Tamil word.
Okay. And it's very similar in almost every language has ma, mom, mother, yeah. Every language has the same word. Because it's the first one babies can make, right?
Yeah,
and
mama.
Yeah. It was her wish that she be buried in an unmarked grave. She'd be buried even without a coffin. They did not put her in a coffin, but they did choose to mark the grave with a simple bird bath. She had a great love for nature, great love for animals, for birds. So they put a bird bath here with her name and the date of her death on it. And every day they come out and they put water in it to ensure the birds can still enjoy this spot.
It wasn't directly mentioned in the video, but her mission was to young girls who were unfortunately sold as prostitutes to temples so that they could fund the temples. So the little girls would escape and she would bring them in and take care of them. She started with just the girls, and then even boys as well were welcomed later on during the ministry. So such a great impact she had for that region there in India. But remember Amy Carmichael. Till next week, let me go ahead and close in prayer. We will finish up the class next week looking at the great hymn writers of this period in history. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the lessons and influence we've had from many of the missionaries that we talked about and those that we were not able to talk about. Lord, you have been using weak men and women forever to fulfill your great calling on our lives. Lord, I pray that we would be willing to do whatever it takes to see the gospel spread, whether here or abroad. Lord, we love you and we thank you. Bless the service in your son's name. Amen.